Olá, bom dia! Está começando agora o terceiro dia da cobertura oficial da NAFA Virtual Experience 2021 pelo Instituto PARAR. E hoje, novamente, trazendo muita coisa boa, muita informação relevante para você que é gestor ou profissional de frotas e quer estar sempre um passo à frente. Então aproveita esse momento antes da gente dar início para enviar o link da transmissão para os seus amigos, para eles compartilharem esse momento conosco também, ok? E só um aviso rápido aqui, antes da gente começar também. Dos dias 19 a 21 de outubro acontece a 7ª edição da Conferência Global PARAR. E a gente está novamente aqui nos desdobrando, para trazer um evento espetacular para você, 100% online. Esse que é o evento de maior relevância do Brasil para a gestão de frotas. Então, o link para saber mais e fazer a sua inscrição nesse evento já está rolando nos comentários e você ainda pode ajudar uma causa muito importante, pois 100% do valor arrecadado com as inscrições será doado à MAAD Brasil, uma instituição que zela aí pelo trânsito e pelas vítimas de acidentes. É importante lembrar que fazendo a sua inscrição, você ainda ganha 20% de desconto em qualquer curso do Pará, tanto o PGF como a pós-graduação. Sem falar, é claro, do conteúdo exclusivo que a gente preparou para você, então não perde essa oportunidade e clica no link dos comentários para saber mais. Eu te espero lá na conferência. Bom, hoje a gente já começa o dia com tudo aqui na nossa cobertura, trazendo um tema para lá de importante que é segurança, A segurança dos condutores é uma responsabilidade que precisa ser levada a sério e garantir a capacitação de quem está dirigindo é um dever do gestor de frotas. E isso é uma coisa de suma importância, pois a gente está falando de vida, a gente está falando da integridade dos condutores e o mais importante é que toda essa cadeia de problemas e custos, que podem vir aí com multas e tal, é uma questão que a gente consegue resolver com cultura de segurança. Nessa sessão, a gente vai ver com o Adam Danielson, diretor de vendas e desenvolvimento de negócios na Supervision, como colocar em prática essa cultura e conhecer a abordagem que ele traz dos desafios que essa tarefa implica. Essa palestra vem com dicas importantes para quem precisa de um acompanhamento melhor dos condutores, tanto no aspecto pessoal quanto no profissional. Então vem aí os riscos de negligenciar a segurança do condutor com Adam Danielson.
Welcome, everyone, to NAFA's 2021 I&E Virtual Experience and our session, The Risk of Overlooking Driver Safety. I'm Shannon McNamara, and I am the Marketing Manager at Supervision. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Adam Danielson, Director of Sales for Supervision. Adam has spent the last 10 years building extensive experience in the fleet safety and driver safety arena. Throughout his career, Adam has had the privilege to work in both the fleet logistics vertical and the risk and safety service vertical, allowing him to accumulate unique insights around maintaining driver safety and mitigating employer risk. Adam supports a supervision team that focuses on providing a comprehensive suite of driver safety solutions and service tools to assist the companies in mitigating risk within their organization and ensuring the safety of their employees. Adam, it's all yours.
Thank you, Shannon, and I want to thank the NAFA team as well for allowing me to join this conference and provide or partake in and share a presentation with my peers and other industry leaders. As we're all aware, it's an ever-growing, ever-changing area within our businesses and around the safety and risk mitigation portions of our world. It's really the key crux to maintaining our driver health and safety and getting them back home each night to have a solid quality of life. So it's a huge responsibility, and we as a peer in the industry are greatly greatly appreciate what you do every day and are committed to help and support in this area. So I'd like to start out by sharing with the people attending that, a little bit more about who we are, as well as what we do. But let's start out by giving you kind of a little bit of an overview. Some of you may be familiar with us, as Shannon explained before. I work for an organization called Explore Information Services. A key component of that particular organization is around our commercial fleet space, which, if you are familiar with us, are probably more familiar with our commercial fleet division that's built around supervision license monitoring. And as we've discussed in the past, we're very proud to say that we can offer the industry's most powerful suite of monitoring, not only from a license monitoring perspective, but also a compliance and safety and performance management solution and solutions into one comprehensive offering for you. Along with that, we have another side to our company, another division that focuses mostly on the insurance space, and has provided cost-effective risk mitigation and avoidance solutions for the property and casualty market. There's many different organizations that we've partnered with and worked with over the years. Many of them you're probably familiar with, those of the likes of the Progressives and the Geicos and the Nationwides of the world are very strong partners of ours. And we're proud to say that we monitor as a total solution over 84 million drivers a month across North America. And then lastly, we've got a very strong government solutions team that provides software solutions around the fuel tax and tracking piece of our over-the-road types of drivers and that type of thing. As well as they support our organization in continually growing and building our relationships with our state and residual data providers that allow us to continually grow our solution and offer the best-in-class solution with even enhanced coverage as well as the breadth of the data. So we've got kind of a three-pronged approach. It's been a very strong team altogether, and we look forward to talking to you more about that in the future. So why we're all here today, the risk of overlooking driver safety. And as we discussed, it's a daunting task that continues to add more hurdles and more pieces of the puzzle that we as safety professionals need to make sure that we are attending to and managing to and creating the best-in-class solution. Drivers are our largest source of the fleet liability risk, but I'd like to look at it more along the lines as they're also our greatest asset within any organization. Our employees are the people that make us who we are today, and without them, we can't perform what our core market tasks are to each individual's customers. So as you look at this, from a high level or a global level, on average, fleets report close to a 20% or more crash rate per year. So if we just start breaking down kind of raw numbers and easy numbers, for a fleet of 1,000 drivers, that means you're managing 200 or more crashes per year. As we are probably all too familiar, and a source of heartache is, accident costs are one of the largest expenses in any fleet, and across multiple categories. Motor vehicle accidents, can have shown costs to employers of up over $56 billion, and that goes back to even as far along as 2017. So it isn't going down at this point. In fact, it's growing exponentially. And a really key stat is 53% of these vehicle accidents cost employees to miss work. So think about that. I mean, we are living right now in an environment, an employment environment that is challenged, It's very difficult to hire. It's from the fleet industry. Oftentimes retention is the biggest challenge of all. So if you do have that employee and they are employed and they are a strong performer, and they end up having some sort of crash, there's over 50% chance or likelihood that they're going to miss at least one day of work, if not more. So it's really going to put a challenge to your, not only are you concerned about the health and the safety of your employee, but it also puts you into a logistical challenge as you try to focus on your day-to-day. So, focus on driver safety and safety culture, can significantly reduce the accident costs and liability risk within your organization. But, before you get there, before you get to what we call a true safety culture, and that can be effective, everybody must buy in, and every level must buy in. So, down to the driver themselves, it might be the fleet managers, but we found that the strongest cultures flow all the way up to the C level, and they're following, if not promoting on a regular basis, a more safe environment and less risk averse. So as we jump in today, we're going to look at 5 probably key overview areas. One of them is let's break it down and discuss, what's the importance of a motor vehicle record or motor vehicle report, and what's all on it and what's involved in looking at it from that perspective. The impact of what license suspensions are doing to your fleet, and do you know about them? Cost of accidents to employers. This usually catches the eye of certain areas within the company, but it's real and it's very costly. Risk of the liability exposure. So it's not even about always knowing and having, but your responsibility of knowing and having the right processes and procedures in place to manage to that, and then closing that gap. Right? What can we do to help you, your teams, your organizations, and your drivers close that risk gap and get home safely? Hopefully you'll have some takeaways from today. We will be having a live interactive question and answer session after this presentation. So we look forward, as we get through the presentation, of having some nice dialogue and interaction. So we talked about motor vehicle reports or motor vehicle records and their importance, and what is that going to look like? When you look at a motor vehicle record, if you have experience with that, sometimes that can be very daunting. First of all, it carries a lot of different information, from the basic information about a driver, license number, expiration, things along those lines, to the accident reports, and then suspensions and violations. And as we walk through this, we want everyone to understand that MVRs, the motor vehicle record themselves, carries a lot of this key information, and it gives us the ability to walk through an incident or try to discover any incidents that may be present with one of your drivers. So, when you start looking at and breaking this down, besides the useful information, there's a status portion. So does your driver have a valid license, or are they suspended, or has it been revoked? Violations, it's a strong history of violations, right? So you can go back in time and or real time, depending on, as we talk about continuous license monitoring, and identify somebody that's had recent violations or past violations. It's interesting, commercial drivers with prior violation convictions are, almost 50% more likely to be involved in an accident within a year, within 1 year from their following a violation. So that, as you can see, you can start to create some predictability around somebody with risky behavior and their propensity to be in an accident. And then accident reports, obviously, pretty straightforward. It is interesting that human error is responsible for 94% of those accidents, and it's getting more dicey out there with distracted driving and things along those lines. Lastly, vehicular crimes. It's kind of a grim description. Vehicular crimes are are a major red flag of risky driver behavior. They show prior negligence on behalf of a driver, and that resulted in a gross misdemeanor or felony. And that could create possible jail times and missed work again due to that type of negligence. 1/3 of all drivers arrested or convicted of drunk driving are repeat offenders as well. So you're starting to see where risk is really coming into play. Unknown risk in some cases, not as much as we have, all of the driver report requirements upon any type of incident. We don't always get that feedback from our drivers, and so it's important that we are able to monitor in that effectively. From our regulated fleet space, our CDL, commercial driver's license, types of drivers, the FMCSA has specific requirements. Most notably, most of us know this as subsection 391.25. And really what it's stating is that there must be a commercial, or there must be an NVR, motor vehicle record, motor vehicle report, pulled on an annual basis for any DOT drivers. You're going to see, as we discuss this and more, or you've already experienced this through legacy types of practices, that this becomes very costly, not only from a raw cost or hard cost perspective, but also from the time, the time, energy, and effort and the employee person power that you need to employ to do all of the auditing and reviews at the end of a year. So that's, just as a quick repeat, 391.25, each motor carrier shall and must pull a motor vehicle record once every 12 months on a particular driver. I know a lot of fleets do it on an annual basis. They set an annual date and they pull that NVR and on all of the drivers. But the key part of this is that, pulling it's one thing, but then auditing it and then taking the time to audit it and consider the evidence that's been provided and make sure that it's following the federal motor carrier safety regulations. That's the important component, is the follow-up. So let's talk about license suspensions. I'd like to kind of put a rhetorical question out to the group here and ask yourself, how many of your drivers do you think, or do you have suspicion have a suspended license? Because I think when we start to break this down a little bit more specifically, you're going to start to see some stats and some data points here that might be a little bit daunting for you. And when you look at this, from the first blush, 7% of drivers have a suspended license. So you folks out there, do the math, start thinking about the size of your fleet and what types of fleets you have, and you can start backing into some numbers to give yourself an idea of, okay, how exposed am I and where's my risk? Here's a scary part: 75% of suspended drivers continue to drive. And I think a big contributor to that is in many cases, or I should say in a strong amount of cases, they may not know their driver's license is suspended. Unless they've gotten a particular incident that related to it, or they've got a notice in the mail or things along those lines. Some of this may be not necessarily due to negligence, or just unknown. And here's what feeds that. 39% of there's 39% of those folks out there are suspended for non-driving offenses. And we'll talk about this in more detail, but this is where I think some of this gets missed, not only by the particular driver, but certainly would be difficult for you folks as employers and fleet managers and things like that to really be able to track, because we're so focused on what did they do and how did they do it on the road. But there's a kind of a little bit of a life outside of work in some other areas that could impact that. You're looking at crash rates again, and how does this all relate? Higher crash rates for suspended drivers versus non-suspended, almost 14 times higher in that particular area. So now you're starting to see that, okay, I'm doing my math, I can see the trend of what's happening here, and now you can start backing into your fleet and really getting an idea, or at least an overview, a sense of what that feels like. scary stat, 1 in every 5 fatal accidents involve a driver with an invalid license. So you can see it's a compounding effect, right? It's not just one factor, it could be multiple factors. But what we are confident in is that it does relate to a more risky driver, and it does relate to higher probability of accidents or any type of fatal type of incident. So as we continue to walk through, the suspensions overview, driver-related grounds for suspension can vary, by state, but we generally have, some ideas and some key areas that tend to create or tend to precipitate a suspension of a license. Reckless driving, careless driving, leaving the scene of an accident will most likely result in a suspension or revocation of some sort. Accumulation of traffic tickets, so unpaid commerce to the states and or jurisdictions. Assault of another motorist, and then multiple DUIs are pretty common types of suspension. And these types of license suspensions are extremely serious. They're often accompanied by additional fines. So there's that fiscal and or cost impact. Legal action in many cases, especially depending on the severity of the violation, you can almost guarantee a DUI will accompany some legal applications and obviously add more risk to you and your organization. And it's important, once you have this information, that we take some action with it as well. A driver manager should take immediate corrective action with a driver, after finding upon report that there's been a suspension. Now any type of violation after the fact of a suspension or down the road from a suspension is going to be exponentially increased on all the events we just discussed. So license suspensions and unknown risk. So here we're going to go back to those non-driving suspensions that we discussed a little bit earlier. Here's some common ones that we see in multiple states. Again, each state reports a little bit differently or has a little bit different suspension and or revocation process, but it could be failure to pay a fine or appear in court. There goes those, drivers or those speeding tickets that weren't taken care of or things along those lines. Non-driving related drug issues, unpaid child support's a big one. And this is where and or defaulting on student loans. This is where I go back to, in some cases, I'm not so sure drivers always know that they're in a suspension as well. They may know that they didn't pay child support, but they may not know that it impacted their license. And so it oftentimes, as an employer, it's almost an impossible task for you to maintain that without some sort of continuous monitoring type of solution where you're constantly pinging and getting that information for your drivers. There's also, we kind of put together what I call a unique list of license suspensions for non-driving offenses. These are by state. In Indiana, if you write a bad check, you could get your license suspended. BWI, boating while intoxicated, hits numerous states. Vandalism in California could get your license suspended or revoked. This is a good one in New York, advocating to overthrow the government. I kind of always chuckle when you see some of these come across, but this is real, and you could get your license suspended for that. And then in Texas, if you're operating an amusement ride while intoxicated, so that's a little bit scary, but obviously it's happened, or we wouldn't have that to report. What we're seeing right now is more than 7 million people nationwide have had their license suspended for failure to pay a court fine or administrative debt. That tends to be the largest area of unknown or non-driving suspension triggers. And these are precursors, right? So we continue to talk about what's the trend, how does it relate to risk, and in driving related suspensions are significant red flags that will and can indicate, a risky driver behavior. It's multiple things adding into a very risky situation. But we oftentimes with the non-driving suspensions, we don't always have those tied into the risk portion or the calculator upon risk. So we got to keep that in mind, that that's a key piece when we're evaluating our drivers. And our recommendation is, the question is, should a manager take action on a driver with a non-driving license suspension? Absolutely. And action or activity does not mean suspension or anything like that. It may mean some sort of a rehabilitative training process or some different steps that they can do to improve and reduce their risk association to the organization. So this is a key component, and I would definitely keep it in your risk assessment breakdown. Well, we all know history repeats itself, and license suspensions, like anything else, they're going to continue to signify that risky behavior. 1 in 3 invalid operators on average sustain 3 or more suspensions or revocations in the 3 years prior to a crash. So when you start seeing these trends of revocation or suspension, it is very likely that it could relate to some risky behavior down the road and potentially cause an accident or a violation to occur. Almost 50% commercial drivers with violation convictions are more likely to be involved in crashes during the year following the conviction. So there again, these are trends we're seeing. These are statistics that we've been building over time, where risky behavior or poor choices in multiple situations end up creating a trend of risky behavior. And so we just ask you, and we repeat to you and your team is just, do a self-assessment every so often. Are you sure with all of the things that we have in place? And we've got some very, very strong safety managers and safety organizations out there. The tools and components are there. Many of you already have very rigid and robust risk and safety programs. But I would say just keep asking yourself that question. Are you sure? Are you sure that we have all of our drivers have a valid driver's license? Costs of accidents typically becomes a very big hot button, especially by leadership and ownership. Once we get into these types of things, it doesn't take long for these types of hard costs and or indirect costs that mount very quickly. And we typically get kind of pulled into a few big main components, but just as we start talking about this, this represents a large and growing category, and it's probably one of your, as a fleet manager, probably one of your highest challenges or highest incidents that create large hits to your budget. We've already talked about this, and we do, there's gonna be a few stats that we repeat because we feel it's important that we all take the severity of this. $56 billion in cost of motor vehicle accidents to employers. Again, 53. Here's that piece that we often forget. 53% of our vehicle accidents are causes employees to miss work, and we all know we can't afford that. And then this, I believe, has probably gone up a little bit more significantly over the past year or so, but over $760 is an average cost of out of service cost for the fleet. So when we start adding these up, or we start breaking it out, the stakes of for managing risk and safety are high, right? As accident severity increases, we know the costs increase as we unfortunately fall into an accident category. When you start looking at an average bent metal crash, single car crash, in many cases, you're probably looking at about $5,800 worth of damage. So again, this is just probably, or not probably, this is only related to like crash and vehicle damage. As you layer in a single injury, so this doesn't include if there was a multi-car crash and there was injuries on both sides or multiple injuries in a vehicle. This is a single injury. Now you're on average of $64,000 in costs. And then, unfortunately, we none of us want to talk about this, or none of us want to ever have this happen. But if there's a single fatality within an accident or a crash, you're probably starting at about $670,000 in costs. And then this is the big piece. We can often see the direct costs. They're more tangible. Most times they're more visible to everyone present, for everyone involved. There's personal injury, there's vehicle damage, workman's comp, towing and storage. The list goes on. They're tangible items that you can see and feel. But it's the indirect costs that is very disruptive. Has a high cost value along with it as well, and really is individual by each employee or employer or organization. But start thinking about what does it cost for a service disruption. We talked about the 53% of the people are potentially going to miss work, a cause to miss work. So what's a service disruption look like? Does it impact a lost client? Do you lose a customer over it because maybe your service fell, or the third bucket, negative reputation. I can't associate myself with this organization anymore because they have too many crashes and accidents, and I see them on the news all the time. And then, claims and legal fees, and we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail here shortly. But nuclear verdicts are real, and they're growing by day, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like from a claim and legal perspective. So we keep asking ourselves, can you afford the risk? Employers, you folks, like I mentioned, have a very, very challenging job every day, and you're doing a great job of reaching out and positioning yourselves. But you have this ongoing obligation. We, not just employers, but we as support vendors and things like that, have an ongoing obligation to track our drivers and our license statuses, NVR histories. If you're not sure or you don't know, I'm going to tell you right now, you're at risk. And now you're back into those numbers that we just discussed a few minutes ago. And here's why. Employers in general, larger organizations, when you're out there and something bad happens, you're perceived to have the deep pockets. You have the wherewithal to settle and make this go away. As we just mentioned, the trend in the industry or in transportation and liability and risk mitigation safety is when an accident occurs, there's more and more nuclear verdicts that are starting to pop out of these types of accidents. And again, it starts with they're thinking that you as an employer have very deep pockets. So what's a nuclear verdict? Well, first of all, it's a $10 million verdict or larger. And as you can see, it hit an all-time high at 280 million just a few years ago. So it's real. It's gonna catch momentum. It already has caught momentum, and it's something that we as safety individuals and employers need to be aware of. And again, we talked about direct cost versus indirect. Whether it's a large direct cost or just bottom line reputation and or lost business, it's going to have significant impact. So we talked about it briefly, but what is negligent entrustment? I feel it's important, and most of you probably are very well aware of it or have been unfortunately maybe exposed to it. But it bodes importance to reiterate it. And negligent entrustment occurs when a dangerous article is entrusted to somebody who is reckless, inexperienced, or incompetent. So it's that simple. And and lawyers and our legal folks that are out there are very good at building on those three components. And a dangerous article is can include a vehicle or does include a vehicle. That doesn't mean it's always just the vehicle that is owned and entrusted to someone to drive it on behalf of the organization. It's also drivers owned vehicles where you may be compensating them and or expecting them to use their vehicle to perform their roles and responsibilities within an organization. So it's not just employer-owned vehicles that are impacted here. And again, it's very straightforward. If it's entrusted to an individual, they have an accident, and if there's an injured party and they want to bring a legal case against the entrusted employer, that's where it starts. And here's what some of the key items that happen in this process. Here's what the plaintiff needs to prove. Did the organization entrust the vehicle to a driver? Was the driver reckless, incompetent, or unlicensed? There we go back to that suspension, right? So if there's a component of suspended license in this scenario, it becomes a very, very strong case very quickly. And the organization knew, or here's the key part, should have known, okay? Whether you have the right things in place or not today, or you have tools that are identifying risky behavior or not, you are expected to know that you may have a reckless, incompetent, or unlicensed driver. It's the lay of the land today, and unfortunately, it's a challenge for you as owners and operators and that type of thing. They can be devastating. They can be, if not fatal. One driver should have had corrective action, but wasn't caught or wasn't found. We just urge you to, do what you can to not open yourself up to this exposure. We have actually a really strong example. This is a true example or a real example of what can happen when and where, and how it can get to a nuclear verdict in a short amount of time. So this is the case of Patterson versus FTS International Manufacturing. There was a pickup truck that was rear-ended by a tractor trailer. So Joshua Patterson was at a stop sign or stoplight in his pickup truck, and a FTS International tractor trailer unfortunately rear-ended Mr. Patterson at a high rate of speed. And some of the key details was the crash resulted in an injury to the pickup driver. And there was a lawsuit regarding negligent entrustment. So let me paint the picture a little bit more in detail. So Joshua Patterson was driving his pickup on US Highway 259 near Ore City, Texas. So if there's anybody down in Texas in that area, you may be familiar with approximately where this is. FTS International Manufacturing employee Bill Acker rear-ended Patterson's truck at a high rate of speed while operating a truck and tractor combination. And after the accident, Patterson sought immediate chiropractic treatment. He underwent some back surgeries and basically was unable to work due to his injuries. Key component here, the post-collision drug test revealed that Acker, he's the driver of the tractor trailer, had marijuana and methamphetamines in his system at the time of the accident. So obviously he was impaired. But here's the key point, and here's where this negligent entrustment piece really takes hold. Acker had been convicted of 3 moving violations within the 36 months prior to his hire date by FTS. FTS was aware of these 3 moving violations. They actually even have a policy that dictated that if a prospective driver had 3 or more moving violations in 36 months prior to the date and time of hire, that the driver would be ineligible for employment. Obviously, we know that they didn't follow their process because obviously Mr. Acker was involved in this accident. So, but the bottom line is this employee should have either not been hired at all, which would have completely erase this from ever happening, or should not have been allowed to drive a vehicle for the business, maybe hired in a different capacity. Unfortunately, for everyone involved, Mr. Patterson for what he suffered and probably continues to suffer with, and then FTS International's not doing their due diligence and getting pulled into a negligent entrustment suit cost them $101 million against FTS in the verdict. Most organizations cannot or will not be able to recover from something like that. So thankfully there was no fatality. However, the impact, the monetary or financial impact was very, very steep. That's where the negligent entrustment liability pieces are going to this day, those nuclear verdicts. So how do we close the gap? I mean, this is the biggest key to any of this is identification is one. We've talked a little bit about that. Understanding the risk is a big piece. But you as employers or as employees responsible for managing the risk and safety within your organization are at a disadvantage because you need support. You could always utilize additional help in this arena as it continues to expand. One of the pieces that can assist and also impact your organization from a diverting risk and identifying risk more quickly is around continuous driver's license monitoring. And that's different, significantly different than what the legacy process, especially for regulated fleets, have been for years, which is around pulling an annual MVR and making sure that we've audited that MVR and seeing what the history over the last 364 days of that driver and their license has been. It's a common practice, as we mentioned, that legacy practice to check an MVR prior to hire, and then also do that annual review. But pulling a driver's license, or excuse me, a motor vehicle record is a snapshot in time. And there's a significant gap that happens from one MVR pull to another, especially if you're doing it on an annual basis. So continuous monitoring allows a fleet manager to receive this real-time data in regard to their driver's license, not only status, but their violation history, and also in many cases, their accident history. So you're able to get this information sooner and in real time. And when I say real time, each state reports a little bit differently, has a different cadence to when they report. Some are daily, some are weekly, some are monthly. But you're getting it within that 30-day or less time frame, whether there's been an incident or a change in driver's license status or an item that needs to be addressed around a particular driver's driver record. You know, while many fleets assume that the annual MVR checks will save time, you know, and there's batch ordering, and we're going to take a day or we're going to take a month to, depending on the size of your fleet, to pull these MVRs and then audit them and then get everything put in line, process it administratively and that type of thing. You're now consuming a considerable amount of time, and you've also have not maintained an up-to-date real-time view of what that driver's license looks like. You're basically going back to a history record at that point. So, you know, we all have to get out of the mindset of a good enough approach. The legacy process of one MVR a year, pulling one annual MVR a year, is I guess it would be a good enough approach. Especially in the regulated fleet space, it does fulfill the requirements by the FMCSA. But where's the exposure? How is that going to impact your organization? You know, let's just take a real quick snapshot. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it's worth seeing the visual. You know, if a company pulls a driver record once a year and a driver, you know, has a violation the day after that, now you've got that 364-day exposure. And how willing are you to take get involved with something along that type of process. So as we look at this, we hire a driver, and then we have a couple of months where no activity has happened. Then in April, the organization pulls annual MVRs on all of their drivers. So now we've got a new clean sheet. We know what everybody's done in the past year. We're kind of starting from scratch, but in May, there's violation activity, and it could be one driver, could be 10 drivers. But we're not continuously license monitoring at this point. So we have to wait until April again before we understand what happened in this violation in May. Not to mention all the other types of potential violations or challenges or alerts that could have happened in that amount of time. So again, it's a simple concept, but what's going on, the other 364 days. The continuous approach closes that gap. So we get the hire in January, we start monitoring immediately. So everything's going on. All of a sudden in April, there's a violation that an alert is triggered to the employer and says, here's what something happened with such and such driver. You should take some action. So now nothing's happened in the February, March timeframe, and we know nothing happened because we're monitoring it. And now we're able to pick up that violation. And then as soon as that continues on, we continue monitoring throughout the rest of the year. So it's just eliminating the gaps. It's a simple concept, but it's crucial, and it allows you to be very proactive, and it allows you to really create a safe culture. So here's just a kind of a quick example that we pulled together. This is a fictitious person, but it just kind of illustrates what can happen in a very common scenario. And we call this gentleman Robert. He's been working for his company with a clean driving record for 5 years. So he's a model employee and a good driver, it appears to be. Then, on an average Friday night, he may stop and have some beverages with some friends. He's probably off duty at that time or not on the clock. But upon leaving, whether it's in a company-owned vehicle, which may have a logo on it, so keep that part in mind. There goes back to that reputation piece. Robert gets pulled over and unfortunately receives a DUI. And what happens immediately in most cases with a DUI, each state's different, the driver's license becomes suspended. Okay, so now we have a trigger. We have a trigger there from a continuous monitoring piece that's going to say, here's an alert. Robert had an issue that's been adjudicated, is printed to the motor vehicle record, gets sent over to the employer, and now they can see that Robert has a suspended license, which is related to a driving under the influence at the time. So we're identifying a lot of things in one little bit of time, a small snippet of time. So what is Robert thinking? We got to think like our employees and our drivers. His annual MVR was just pulled, per like the example we showed previously. And it was clean. As we know, he's had a very good driving record. He could be fired. So company policy says if he reports a driving under the influence, there is potential for losing employment. He could fight the DUI and potentially get it absconded from his record before his next annual MVR. So maybe there's a strategic approach by Robert because he knows that nothing will get audited until almost a year from now because of the last annual MVR was just pulled. But guess what? We go back to that suspension again. That's still looming out there with a DUI, potential conviction still looming out there. And Robert, because he hasn't self-reported, may not have another MVR or alert triggered to his company for a full year because there isn't a continuous license monitoring component. He's now driving a company vehicle on company time with a suspended license. And so when you start to really break it down, how do you handle it as an employer? How do you want to best handle this situation in the future? How I can tell you right now that pulling an annual MVR puts a significant amount of exposure out there versus introducing a form of continuous license monitoring. It's bold and it's out there. 20% of your drivers are responsible for 80% of the risk. We've gotten multiple test data applications that we've done. We've seen it across numerous different fleets. Don't get me wrong, there are some higher risk fleets out there that might be in that 35% range or more. The other key component to this that gets missed is of that 20%, it's typically 80% of those drivers that are creating all your risk. So you oftentimes can really, really drill down and pin down where your most risky drivers are within your organization. And by addressing it, whether it's, unfortunately, if there's multiple violations and you need to relieve the person of their duties, or, get them vigorously enrolled in some of your training programs and rehabilitate them, you're able to identify that quickly and really drill it down to those few. So we talk about benefits, monitoring benefits to your program. A lot of it, we oftentimes get focused on expenses and costs. We talked about this a little bit, and we're gonna kind of share with you some different areas and components on what this looks like. But MVR expense, if you're able to offset it with continuous license monitoring, and now focus on ordering 20% of the volume of MVRs you would normally have had to order in the past due to the volume of your driver pool. Now you've significantly reduced just the raw expense of the MVRs themselves. Let's take a look at this. If an employer can choose to do a more frequent and monitored approach versus an annual, here's some numbers that kind of stand out. If we take an average of $10.14 for an MVR, MVR's costs vary by state, and obviously your location and or your geographic of your drivers may impact this number. So we're trying to use an average here, and we'll base it on a 1,000 driver fleet. The raw math to start it out on an annual MVR, this is only MVR expense now. Motor vehicle record expense is over $10,000. Now, when we introduce a continuous license monitoring and you're able to deflect and maybe not have to pull a full roster of annual MVRs, take that 20% of the hit rate that you had and also spread it out throughout a year's time, and now you're looking at just over $2,000 in total MVR expense. So we're going to reduce the MVR expense. Now we got administrative time on top of this, and I know in some organizations, depending on the size of the fleet, they dedicate a month to audit and review MVRs in order to make sure that they've gotten through all of their different drivers. So, manually reviewing MVRs, we're basing this off of, depends on your fleet, obviously, but an average that we've found is pretty comparable, is about 5 minutes per MVR to review and or audit. So let's do it again. Let's base it on the 1,000 driver fleet. And now you're looking at close to 83 hours in labor, administrative labor, to audit those MVRs. And that doesn't include if there's certain other processes within your organization that may add more time to that from a recording and a review perspective. And then if we're backing this out, basing it on that 20% hit rate again, now we're able to look at it from more closely to a 17 to 20 hour review time and audit time, and again, spread out through the year. So you're not dedicating days in a row or months in a row for a person or persons within your organization to help you audit these types of annual MVRs across large fleets. So then let's, obviously where we all want to get to, and this goes back to closing that gap, is reducing the risk and damages related to an accident. We've seen these numbers before, so I won't belabor them, but as we're removing risky drivers from your organization or training them up and getting them more training to become a more responsible driver, we're basing these average costs again against a 1,000 driver fleet. when we're looking at kind of a raw return on investment, on average, you're looking at you could monitor for 4 years of continuous license monitoring for less than what you would invest in one injury or a single injury accident. If you're looking at a single fatality accident, you could invest 40 years of monitoring before you would eclipse the costs that it would be that you would incur on a single fatality accident. So these are really strong numbers to say, hey, for a little bit of reassurance, insurance, continuous monitoring can provide a huge return on an investment. And quite frankly, these numbers don't mean a whole lot to me. What means the most to me, and I think all of us, is that just eliminating the fatal crash, right, is priceless. Our greatest assets are our employees, and all we want is them to return home to their families and live a fruitful life. From a regulated fleet, perspective, we can also tie this in with our CSA scores and benefits that we've seen with continuous license monitoring, as well as how it impacts our compliance, safety, and accountability programs. If you look at this, the number of safety events assigned, from a CSA perspective, as many of you are aware, if you have a CDL type fleet, there's an assigned percentile rank, often, what we call the CSA score. It's grown and built on, 7 behavior analysis and safety improvement categories, including the ones that we've shown in this, the chevron here, where it's, crash indicators, driver fitness, reducing the number of invalid CDL occurrences, unsafe driving, hours of service. These are all components. When you look at just hours of service, for example, operating a commercial vehicle when sick or fatigued and not maintaining records, duty, and status. With combining this with the driver continuous license monitoring, you may start to see some violations that have occurred that tie into some of these CSA scores. Hazardous materials is another piece. Controlled substances is a big piece, right? That often can be tied into an alert around a DUI or something along those lines. So if you're running DOT drivers today, I know you're familiar with those 7 basics and scores. It's extremely important to keep your scores down, as as not only can they, the FMCSA put some prohibitions on your organization, but it can also affect your ability to procure new business as well. Oftentimes, as you're probably seeing, your customers are getting more savvy and want to understand that you are doing everything you can do to maintain your risk mitigation and safety for your drivers. Two really key basics that can positively be affected by continuous monitoring. I would say the most closely related are going to be in the crash indicator. So we're going to try to reduce those number of accidents and identify when accidents occur. And probably your driver fitness score, reducing the number of invalid CDL occurrences that could be related to some monitored events. This is just a graphical depiction of some things that we've studied and tested over time. There are major benefits to keeping your driver fitness basic scores low. On average, we're finding that our monitoring customers experience a 17% decrease in their driver fitness scores within just 6 months of when they start monitoring. So there are correlations here, because now you're taking action much sooner than you would have if you're doing that legacy process. And what's even been more exciting is that exponentially within 1 to 2 years of monitoring, driver fitness scores have decreased. We've seen decreases between 28 and 30% from the date they began monitoring. So again, direct correlations and how you can control it and use that information to put in those processes and use the combined effort to improve your safety scores. Here's the crash indicator piece. Again, another tied in piece, as we mentioned, and we're seeing over 30% reduction in just 2 years within starting monitoring with our organization. So again, crash, we're starting to identify those risky drivers sooner. We're training them so that they become less risky, or we're removing them, and which is going to impact and provide a much more strong, safe environment within the organization. So a quick case study that we did with some friends of ours from Upper Midwest, a company with about 1,300 to 1,400 drivers, that we were able to identify some of these efficiencies and safety tools that have crossed over and impacted our customers very positively. So the big piece here is they're right around 1,300 to 1,400 drivers. When they came to us, the company was ordering, required MVRs, but there was challenges around the CDL suspensions and violations that weren't getting picked up. So we started doing driver's license monitoring with them, as well as some of our additional support safety tools. And as they implemented a continuous license monitoring program, their driver fitness score was reduced by 49% in just 1 year. So that identification, the ability to get that real-time information and turn that into actionable items, allowed them to really turn their CSA fitness score around. So protecting your fleet, our fleet, as friends and supporters of our customers, we need to change our mindset from pulling that, just being reliant on an annual MVR pull that is going to be effective in maintaining and identifying risky drivers. One MVR a year is just not enough. It's too risky, and more oftentimes can be a much more cumbersome a management piece, due to the fact that you may be needing to do an assessment of 1,000+ drivers. So we've identified where the challenges are. It's in the gap. MVRs are a component of managing your drivers more effectively. The motor vehicle record is the key item that gives you all of the information and data, but you need to know when to pull it, and you need to know when your drivers are performing in a risky manner. Again, the cost of not knowing, $56 billion, resonates with many of us, if not most of us. And the nuclear verdict piece, it's real and it's growing each day, and we don't see in the industry that changing unless we can start to combine forces and do as best a jobs as we can in putting a risk and safety process in place that keeps us less exposed. So, layering in continuous monitoring is a good first step. It's a way that you can make that identification in real time, or as real time as possible, once the piece has been adjudicated. It gives you that identification that you can take action on. It's going to immediately mitigate some risk, especially if you are sharing this with your organization and everybody's on board of trying to improve and take a team effort. Maybe some gamification happens out of it. You're certainly going to lessen your expense and administrative burden, and all the components that fall into place around that. And obviously, the ultimate goal is to reduce your safety scores as it's related to CSA, but really more about getting that identification and taking that action right away. I'll be candid, and sometimes I feel like I maybe shouldn't share it, but the continuous license monitoring, as I mentioned, is a very, very key component. It's the identification component. So without the identification, you can't take any action. But it is imperative that you, as an organization, do the best that you can to have some sort of process or mitigation or training piece that you can associate with it after you have identified that risk. it's a key component. We've, as an organization, seen that that piece, that required piece as well. Beyond our stalwart continuous license monitoring solution, our supervision solution, we've layered that with multiple other risk and safety components that we've developed that are comprehensive and layered in with our license monitoring tool. And it could be, components from different areas as well. I use this as an example just because the multiple points of data are key. They're very important, and when you can layer different components of different data points, you can paint yourself a much stronger picture and the direction of where you want to take that action as you grow. Safety, we talked about CSA monitoring, safety performer monitoring, things like that, are pulling in telematics, pulling in different components that can identify both risky behavior and those of your employees that are actually out there and performing in a very safe manner. We consider ourselves the only true continuous license monitoring solution in the United States and Canada, but tying it in with all of the additional products and services, and these could be different vendors and supporters in your world as well, really gives you a strong view of where your opportunities are with your risk and safety management. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time today and logging into this presentation. Again, it's an honor. We're grateful to be part of the solution. So again, thank you for joining the Risk of Overlooking Driver Safety presentation.
Gente, muito interessante a abordagem que o Adam traz, né? A gente vê que realmente com segurança não se brinca. Nosso bloco da manhã vai ficando por aqui. Hoje mais tarde, às 16h30, aqui no YouTube mesmo, a gente se vê de novo para mais um painel muito interessante que vai rolar na nossa cobertura. Quer um spoiler? A gente vai falar sobre política de frotas. Eu tô te aguardando, beleza? Até mais tarde!